Welcome back. In this session, we will continue our discussion on GDP and explore two important dimensions. First, we will take a closer look at GDP as a tool for measuring economic performance. While GDP is one of the most commonly used indicators to assess how an economy is doing, it has its own limitations. It captures the market value of all goods and services produced in a country in a given period of time, but it misses out on several important aspects of human well-being, like unpaid household work, environmental damage, or income inequality. So, even though changes in GDP can tell us something about economic growth, we need to ask what exactly does it measure and what does it leave out. So, in the second part of this session, we will turn on how GDP and national income are actually measured in India. We will discuss on the key government agencies involved and the main methods used in the national income accounting in India, and some practical challenges such as estimating output from the informal sector or dealing with data revisions. So, understanding these details helps us to interpret GDP numbers more accurately and apply them more effectively in policy discussion. So, let's begin with what GDP includes and what it doesn't. So, the one of the important main concept that we use in the GDP definition is goods and services. So, when we see goods and services, GDP includes both tangible goods and intangible services. Tangible goods means food, clothing, cars, etc. And intangible services like haircut, doctor visits, music concerts, etc. So then the second component, the GDP means the market value of goods and services produced. That is the second element in the definition, that is produce. Produce is the second element. So GDP only includes goods and services currently produced during the given period of time. So it's a flow concept, meaning it measures production within a specified time frame, typically a year or a quarter. So it doesn't include items produced in earlier years. So GDP is not a stock concept, it's a flow concept. That means whatever goods and services produced in a given period of time. If you are taking one quarter, then whatever goods and services produced during that given quarter, or if you are taking 1 year, so whatever goods and services, whichever we mention here, produced during the given 1 year period of time. So if we something produced in the previous year, that is not included in GDP. So for example, Tata, the company, produces and sells a new car, that is included in GDP. But what about a person sells a used car to another? That is not included in GDP. But services related to the resale, for example, the dealer fees, transaction charges, spare parts, they are actually part of economic activity this year. So that part, the services related to this resale, that is part of the GDP. So you can see that, for example, through the used car dealers like True Maruti, True Value. So there, what is the original selling value, when the company buys that car, and what is that car value or purchase car? For example, it bought, for example, for one car for 5 lakhs, that is the purchasing price by this company. They bought this one, and when they are selling it, for example, they are selling it, for example, 7 lakhs, then what you can see that the 5 lakhs, this is the price of the old car. This dealer, they got it from a seller, person who is selling this car, he or she sold it for 5 lakhs to this company, and companies, by adding its profit, transaction charges and spare parts, and they are selling it for 7 lakhs. So out of this, what we need to add to the GDP is this 2 lakhs we need to add. So here 2 lakhs is part of GDP, but these 5 lakhs are not part of this GDP. Then let us move to another aspects, interpreting national income and output. So GDP is the market value, right? So then the main part of the definition, we have highlighted that GDP is the market value. So GDP combines all final goods and services into a single monetary value. This allows us to compare different types of output like food, education or transport on a common scale. So let us make it clear here what GDP includes and what GDP excludes. So GDP includes everything, even if not welfare enhancing. For example, GDP includes all goods and services legally sold in markets. Even items that do not improve human welfare are counted in the GDP measurement. For example, guns, tobacco, alcohol, these are not contributing much to the human welfare, but if you are producing more guns and more tobacco, we see that the GDP is growing. That means the factory income is growing, expenditure is growing. However, we need to remember that some components of GDP may not contribute, may not directly improve human welfare, and is actually deteriorate human health or human welfare sometimes. So what GDP excludes mainly goods and services not traded in markets, because we are calculating the market value of goods and services. So those goods and services that are not traded in markets, such as underground or informal economic activities, are not included. Similarly, illegal production of goods and services are not part of GDP. And another important components that we are missing out in the GDP calculation is unpaid household work. For example, a maid's salary is included in GDP, but a housewife work is not. So that means in your home, if you are employing a maid and the salary paid to the maid is part of the GDP, but if you are not employing anyone, you are doing all this activity your own, but that is not part of GDP. Similarly, salary paid to a security guard is included for your home, but for if you are guarding your own house, that is not included in the GDP measurement. So what clearly means here that the unpaid household work is not included in the GDP measurement. So another component is of all. So all means GDP that I already mentioned is the market value of all goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. So of all means is a comprehensive coverage. So GDP includes everything produced legally and sold in markets. So cover goods and services across sectors, agriculture, manufacturing and services, etc. All these are included in the GDP measurement. So what GDP exclude, which I already a little bit given a hint in the previous slide, goods and services produced and consumed at home, these do not enter the marketplace. Those goods and services that is not entering the marketplace, hence not captured in GDP. For example, agriculture products that you are getting from, farm product that you are getting from, vegetable that you are getting from the kitchen garden, if you are not selling, that is not part of GDP. And if you are producing agriculture product, but if you are not selling at the market, this is not coming to the marketplace and hence excluded. So simply to summarize this one, to give some example, what all included and what all excluded. So included items are mainly included in GDP. For example, vegetables bought from a grocery store is included, but vegetables grown and consumed in your own garden is excluded. So lunch purchased at a restaurant is part of GDP, but if you have home cooked lunch, that is not part of GDP, but the ingredients that you are using for your lunch and that is bought from the market, that will become part of GDP. Similarly, paying for laundry service at a shop is part of GDP, but if you are ironing your own clothes at a hostel or at your home, then that service is not part of GDP, but the consumption of electricity, that is going to be a part of GDP. But your labor service in doing your own work, that ironing your clothes from your home at hostel, that is not part of GDP. So then why do we have seen there are lots of limitations of GDP, because GDP, it includes so many items, at the same time it also excludes so many other components, but that is also part of economic activity, but that is not coming in the GDP measurement. So GDP reflects the total economic activity, and it is one of the most widely used indicators to measure the overall level of output in an economy. So then the natural question is, why is it valuable? So changes in GDP over time help us to understand how the economy is growing or contracting. It captures the trends in national income and production levels. So then how do we interpret it? So when assessing whether the economy is doing well or poorly, we naturally look at how much income people are earning, and whether jobs and output are increasing or not. Okay, so then finally some more aspects in this slide. What does GDP ultimately tell us? So GDP is a broad indicator of economic performance. It helps policymakers, businesses and citizens track progress and compare across time or countries. Let us see this table. So this table helps us compare living standards across countries using multiple indicators. So you can see that high income countries, for example USA, Canada, UK, Germany, high income countries not only have high per capita income, but also better health outcomes, greater access to services and more infrastructure. So when you look at India and other developing countries, you can see that they are lagging behind in most indicators, especially in health and doctor availability. You can see here maternal mortality, under 5 mortality and all, highlighting gaps in both income and social development. However, you can also see that the mobile phone, this phone, you know that these days mobile phone across is improving and showing signs of convergence. So if you look at the GNI per capita here, closely if you look at the GNI per capita, this value, what you can see here is that high income countries like the USA, Canada, Germany, Australia, they report GNI per capita above 40,000. In contrast, countries like India has 3,910 and China has 9,014. So it reflects large income disparities between developed and developing countries. So this also reflected in the health outcomes, access to services and technology access as well. Then another measure we have seen in the previous session, that so we can calculate the per capita income from GDP by dividing GDP values by the size of population. From there we will be getting what is the average income of a country. But then why GDP per capita is not enough? The reason is that GDP per capita is not enough mainly because GDP per capita is often used to compare income levels across countries, but it doesn't tell us how income is distributed within a country. For example, two countries may have same per capita income. Maybe say we just take an example of two countries which have same per capita income, but in one most people may earn around the average, but in the other country, while in another country a small elite may earn most of the income. So what does it mean? It means there is a income inequality. So to capture this distributional aspect, we look at the inequality measures. So in this context, we use Gini coefficient, which is one such measure. It will tell us how unequal a society is with values closer to 1, indicating inequality. So you can see here that the Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1. So when the Gini coefficient, the estimated Gini coefficient is 0, that means perfect equality. Everyone's income is around the average, and 1 means perfect inequality. That means there is completely skewed. The income is mostly skewed among the rich people. Only a few and most people, their income is much lower than the average. So higher the value, more unequal is the income distribution. So however, GDP has been used to estimate the economic growth rate. That is one of the most important uses of GDP is to measure how fast the economy is growing. So the GDP growth rate tells us the pace at which total output is changing from one period to the next. So a growing GDP usually means more jobs, higher income, and improved living standards. So growth can happen. Higher the GDP means it is growing at a higher economic growth. The higher the economic growth rate means GDP is growing at a higher pace. So I have given you the formula how to calculate economic growth rate. Suppose if you want to calculate the GDP growth, the economic growth this year, then what you need to do that, what is the last year GDP and what is the this year GDP, then accordingly we need to make a calculation. Suppose last year GDP is this one, the T minus 1, and this year GDP is this value. Suppose this year, last year we produce 100 and this year we produce 110, then you need to divide it with the previous year, that is 100. So what you are getting is 10%. So the GDP growth rate is 10%. This is what we report normally when we say economic growth rate is 10%. What we actually meant is this economic, that is growth rate in this GDP. So GDP growth rate is synonymous to economic growth rate. So that this is the formula. Normally is expressed as a percentage term. So this is 10% is the, from this example, 10% is the economic growth rate. So then a natural question here is that when we talk about GDP growth rate, what drives the GDP growth rates over time? So a growing GDP usually means more jobs, higher income or improved living standards. So growth can happen either because a country is using more resources, that is more labor force and more capital, or because, and it's not only be or, and or because is using them more efficiently through technology or innovation. So two components that drive the GDP growth rate. One is quantity of resources. That means the resources available to the country, labor force, capital and other natural resources. And second one is the efficiency of production. If the country is technologically advanced, they can produce more GDP with less resources, less labor force and less capital. They can produce more goods and services. And if they have better organizational and they have high productivity and they have the human capital, the quality of the human capital is very high and mostly highly skilled and educated labor force, that will improve the efficiency of production. So it doesn't mean that if we have more labor and more capital, we can produce more goods and services. Those countries, even with low labor force and low capital availability, if their efficiency of production is very high, and then they can produce more goods and services, they can produce more GDP. So then another distinction is between nominal GDP and real GDP. So when we talk about GDP growth rate, it's important to distinguish between nominal and real GDP. So nominal GDP, it measures, it reflects both price and quantity changes. It tells us about how much the economy is producing in terms of current market prices. So the definition I have given here, it measures the value of output at the current market prices, and it reflects changes in both prices and quantities. So simply the definition is that nominal GDP measures the value of output in a given period using the prices of that period. So the GDP normally what we calculate every year is GDP at a nominal price, that is the nominal GDP. So but the concern here is that as compared to previous year, this year for example, there is increase in prices. Then you can see that the nominal GDP may increase even if output stays constant. So But in this case, we use the concept called real GDP. So real GDP removes the effect of inflation by keeping prices constant. So it captures the actual growth in production. So this distinction helps us understand whether the economy is growing because we are producing more or simply because prices have gone up. So real GDP, it measures output at constant prices. That means it has been adjusted for inflation. So real GDP reflect changes in the actual volume of production. So real GDP measures changes in physical output by valuing goods at prices from a base year. So it enables comparison of economic performance over time without price distortion. So why the distinction matters? Because it helps distinguish between price level changes and real economic growth. So from this, when we have nominal GDP and real GDP, then we can calculate GDP deflator. This we will be using in this variable. For estimating inflation, we will be using GDP deflator, and this has been calculated by this. When nominal GDP is divided by real GDP multiplied by 100, we will get GDP deflator. This is one of the measure of inflation. So this table tells us the distinction between nominal and real GDP at market prices. These are the some of the reflections here. I have some bullet points here. One is nominal GDP rose sharply from 1900 to 2013 due to both output growth and inflation. That is the money GDP or nominal GDP. Real GDP also increased because this one is calculated at the 1990 price. It also increased, showing true growth in production over time. So this is the true growth rate, true economic growth in this country. So another reflection is that GDP deflator shows rising price levels, because when we divide money GDP by real GDP times 100, you are going to get implicit GDP deflator. Assuming 1990 as 100, then you can see there is increasing price level from 1.7 to 183.5 in 2013. So the main takeaway here is real GDP gives a clear picture of economic progress by adjusting for inflation. So let's now move to the last part of this session, that is national income accounting in India. Let me start with the official agencies. It's mainly done by the Central Statistic Office under the MOSPI, and who is responsible for compiling national income estimates. So data is published annually or even quarterly. Sector-wise, quarterly GVA also reported separately for agriculture, manufacturing and service sector. Then the base year for GDP calculation, the current base year for GDP estimate is 2011-12, and you know why we are using it? Because in order to get the real GDP, because nominal GDP, it suffers from inflationary aspects, inflationary components. So because in order to adjust for inflation, we calculate the base year, real GDP or GDP at base year. Current base year is 2011-12. So the base year is periodically revised to reflect structural changes in the economy. So for estimating GDP, we use all the three methods, production methods. This is mainly used in the agriculture sector, and income method is mainly used in the manufacturing and service sector, and expenditure method is mainly used to get the GDP calculation from the construction sector. So that means for different sectors, we don't use each and every method for all the sectors. It has been used based on the convenience, which would yield more robust method. Accordingly, these methods have been used. So the key indicators, I would suggest to get the key indicators, you please visit the CSO website, and also in the economic survey, in the PDF, there is a statistics section, appendix is there. There you will get the key GDP indicators. However, one of the main concern in India to measure GDP is the informal sector estimation and data lag and frequent revision, it all affect the reliability of the GDP measure. However, the integration of GST data and digital records has improved accuracy in recent years. So in India, we calculate GDP by different sectors and subsectors. You can see primary, secondary, transport, communication and trade, finance and real estate, community and personal services, and each of them have some subsector as well. For example, agriculture, you can see that it has 4 subsectors. So GDP has been calculated by using sector wise as well as subsector wise classification. So I'm just showing you a screenshot of the CSO website. You please go through this and you'll get lots of information about how GDP has been calculated, what is the methodology CSO has been following. So I'm also giving you some more linkages, web links. You can visit and get more information, more details about GDP concepts and its calculations. So then before I conclude this session, let us also see how we compare GDP across countries, international comparison of GDP. So normally we calculate GDP, for the comparison, we convert GDP in US dollars in nominal terms. So it reflects the total market value of goods and services produced by a country using current exchange rates. So this is highly sensitive to currency fluctuation and doesn't account for cost of living differences. So you can see here that this is the GDP estimates. When we convert this into US dollar, we can make a direct comparison of GDP. For example, USA has 26 trillion, but India has only 3.7 trillion US dollar. And then the issue here is that it reflects the purchasing power, because the price of goods and services or the cost of buying these goods and services are not same in USA, China or India. Maybe some of the goods and services are much cheaply available in India or in China. For the same goods and services, maybe you need to pay high price in the USA. For example, labor charges are very high in the US, but in China or in at least in India is not that high. So in order to do that, the purchasing power, we need to get the GDP that reflect the purchasing power, because what is this GDP means? GDP means the market value of all goods and services, fine. At the same time, this is the income that the economy is generating. So that means it also reflects the standard of living. Suppose with your income, you can buy more goods and services in your country than the other country, then your GDP, you need to adjust this with the purchasing power parity. So GDP by purchasing power parity, it adjusts GDP to account for the differences in the cost of living and inflations. So it provides a better comparison of living standards and economic well-being. So look at, for example, here, the same GDP when we adjusted for the purchasing power parity, now Indian GDP has become 13 trillion and Chinese GDP has become 33 trillion from 17 trillion. It become the largest economy. So simply from this data itself, you can say that when GDP in US dollar, US is the first largest economy, but when we use GDP as the purchasing power parity, then China becomes the first largest economy in the world. So all this data you can get from the World Bank data panel. So you please visit the World Bank data panel and you'll get what is the purchasing power parity index and how they calculate, how they convert GDP in US dollar nominal terms to GDP by PPP. Thank you for watching this video and see you in the next session. Thank you.